Hey, you guys, my name is Josh Johns, and I'm excited to have the opportunity to be able to be with you guys tonight through this virtual setting and be able to share this lesson with you guys. It's been a blessing to me as I've studied it and read over it this week and kind of prepared for it. And I'm excited to be able to share it with you guys. And I know we started off with a video of a roller coaster. I don't know about you guys. I love roller coasters. I think they're super fun, the adrenaline rush. It's just an absolute blast to me. I grew up in Raleigh, North Carolina, and a couple hours from where I live, there's a big theme park called Carowinds. And they have one of my favorite roller coasters. It's called Fury. It's just fast, it's smooth, it's fun. But one thing you always think about, if you've ever ridden a roller coaster before, you know this, and that is that when you're on a roller coaster, one of the first things they do when you sit down is there's some kind of restraint system, and it kind of comes over you. Some they pull over from the top, some come over your waist. There's a couple of different ways of doing it, but every roller coaster I've ever been on has had some sort of restraint system. But those restraints are there to help us, right? We wouldn't want to ride a roller coaster if there were no restraints. In fact, we'd go flying off the top of the roller coaster. I don't know about you guys, but personally, I'd prefer to stay in my seat on the roller coaster and live to ride another roller coaster another day. But guys, tonight we're going to take a look, and we're starting a series on the book of Daniel. And I think it's absolutely awesome. It's one of my favorite books of the Bible. As we look at it, we're going to see the lives of four young men that the restraints that have been in their life for their whole life, they're taken off. These restraints that maybe their parents had put on them or those around them, their loved ones, they're totally taken away as they find themselves in foreign circumstances. And we're going to look at how they react to that and at what we can learn as they go through this time in their life. And we're going to look at how it can help us and standing strong for our faith. And that's kind of the theme of this series, is standing strong even in adversity. We're gonna look at some adversity they face as they go through this. And guys, I'm excited about it. So grab your Bibles, go ahead and open to the book of Daniel chapter 1 is where we're gonna be starting. And we're gonna dive into it in one moment. So kind of to set the context here for what we're looking at in Daniel 1, look at the first few verses here with me. We're going to look at 1, and we're going to read down through verse 4. And it says, "In the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, came Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, on Jerusalem, and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand with a part of the vessels of the house of God, which he carried in the land of Shinar to the house of his God. And he brought the vessels into the treasure house of his God. And the king spake unto Ashpenaz, the master of his eunuchs, that he should bring certain of the children of Israel, and of the king's seeds, and of the princes, children in whom was no blemish, but well favored, and skillful in all wisdom, and cunning, and in knowledge, and in understanding science, and such as had ability in them to stand in the king's palace, by whom they might teach the learning and the tongue of the Chaldeans." Guys, we're going to look at this, and we see that Daniel and his friends here, they're taken away from their home country. They go through this really a terrible circumstance. It's nothing that any of us would ever want to go through, being ripped from our families. Their families may have been taken somewhere else. Some of their family members may have even died through this whole situation. We're not really given that. God doesn't tell us what happened to their families, but there could be a lot of emotions that they're thinking about and dealing with as they go through this. And as we look at this, we're going to look at how God's purposes are greater than our problems. That's going to be kind of the theme tonight, and you will see that several times. I'll say that phrase a few times, and I'm going to say it several times because I think it's important. I want it to be something that kind of sticks in your mind as you go through the rest of your week, that God's purpose is greater than my problems and the problems that I'm facing. So we're going to dive in and we're going to look at that. We're going to look at the lives of these young men. And before we jump into our first point, I want to read Daniel 1:6. It says, "Among these were the children of Judah, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah." This is that group of young men we're talking about. You probably know them better by their other names, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and we'll talk more about that in a minute. But Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, that was their Hebrew names that they're given, and they're taken into this land of Egypt. And the first thing that we're going to look at tonight, we're going to see how we can stand firm in our pursuit of God, how to stand firm in our pursuit of God. How do we do that? And we're going to look at a few subpoints here on how we can look at, and just kind of some practical things that we can apply to our life as we look at the story of these four young men. So we see that they're taken away to this land. It's a totally different lifestyle than what they grew up in. It's extremely different. It's a pagan culture instead of a culture where Judaism, they serve one God. Babylon has many gods, very flesh-centered, versus where even in Judaism, they were very centered around God and around serving him. And as we look at this, first thing I want you to notice is that their environment changed, but their faith didn't. Daniel, we're going to look at that. We see in Daniel 1:1-3, we just read it, and for sake of time, I'm not going to read through it again. we see that, like I was saying, their environment is totally different than it was before. They're not in the same home. They're not with the same people. They have each other, but this is a very small group. In fact, we don't know how well these men even knew each other before they were all captured and taken away together into slavery. They may have just met that day and in these days leading up to the events that we're going to look at today. But we see that even though they're in a place where they could do anything they want, anything that had previously been condemned by their culture, they chose to stand firm and their faith didn't change. Letter B, we see their schooling changed, but their wisdom didn't. As we look in verses 3 through 5, we've already read 3 and 4, and we see that, hey, these are men, they were already wise, they're cunning. These Babylonians kind of pick the best of the best to capture and take away and kind of groom them to a place where they can serve in the king's courts. That's kind of the position that they want these young men to be in. They want them to be serving King Nebuchadnezzar, be in his courts, be some of the wise men there in Babylon. So maybe as they're getting there, they're saying, hey, maybe this isn't so bad. We're going to have the chance for some more schooling. We're going to be learning some. But we see that even though their schooling and everything they've been taught is changing, their wisdom and what God had given them and what had been given to them, it's not changed. It remains the same. Guys, as we look at that, we see that this isn't just some grueling textbook-based academic rigor they're being put through. When we look in verse 5, it tells us the king appointed them a daily provision of the king's meat and of the wine which he drank. And he nourishes them for 3 years so that at the end thereof they might stand before the king. Probably the best comparison we would know this. It's almost like going to a college, except for you don't get to choose your college. You're forced to go there, but at least they have good food. And that's kind of the situation they find themselves in. They're learning about a new language. They're learning about a new culture. And because they have to be in the position that the Babylonians wanted them to be in, they'd have to understand the culture and language of the Chaldeans. That way they can help and assist in some of these day-to-day tasks within the kingdom. As we look at that, they're going through this 3-year program. The king provides this meat. And you may be saying, hey, well, the food sounds pretty good. It's kind of the best of the best, right? They're not going to give the king's meat's not going to be anything that's bad by any stretch of the imagination, right? But yet, as we look at them, they wisely choose to continue serving God, and they don't partake of this meat simply because it was offered to idols and it went against their faith and against the wisdom that God had given them. And guys, there's going to be times that things change in our life. Maybe you do end up at a different school, or you go to a college one day where they're teaching something different than what you've grown up learning. But I encourage you guys, you got to stand fast in what the Bible says and what's been given you and what you've learned from the Bible and your parents and your pastor. That's something you need to hold on to and hold on to for the rest of your life, because we live in a culture that's quickly trying to take it right away from us, and we can't allow that to happen. Letter C, here under point 1, we see that their names changed, but their identities didn't. And we alluded to this a little bit earlier in the fact that, hey, their name here has changed. Their Hebrew names, they have Ananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. And as we look down in verse 7, it says, unto whom the prince of the eunuchs gave names. For he gave unto Daniel the name Belteshazzar, and Hananiah, Shadrach, Mishael, Meshach, and Azariah, Abednego. Guys, so we see that their names are changed. And I can't really imagine what that would be like if someone took me to a foreign country and they look at me and say, hey, we're not even going to call you Josh anymore. You're now going to be Steve. I don't know about you guys. I kind of like my name like it is. It's kind of part of who I am. And it'd be really, really weird, right? It makes you kind of almost question who you are to some small degree. But guys, as we look at that tonight, we see that Nebuchadnezzar changes their names and these Babylonian names. And it's interesting to note that Daniel was also given a new name. We still know Daniel by Daniel, his Hebrew name, which we really don't know 100% why. It could be because he recorded much of this for us. Not for sure why it was chosen and why the Bible was that way, other than that's how God ordained it to be. But we know that even though their names are changed and they're being called something different, who they are inside didn't change, guys. And make Christianity and the Bible and serving the Lord and being a disciple part of your identity. Make it part of the core of who you are. And then letter D here, we see their responsibilities changed, but their convictions didn't. They have a whole new set of responsibilities. There's a whole bunch of different things there, and the easy thing to do would just be go along with it, take it, do your best, get it done, get out of there. Don't make waves, right? Don't make a ripple. Just sit down, be quiet, and do what you need to do. But yet, we see, and we look in Daniel 1:8, we see that Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the portion of the king's meat, nor with the wine which he drank. Therefore he requested of the prince of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself. Guys, Daniel is here and he makes a decision. Hey, he purposes in his heart. It's a decision he'd already made. Hey, I'm going to serve God no matter what. I'm not going to defile myself. I'm not going to let these circumstances take away what God has given me and what I know is right. And guys, he knew that this would violate God's rules, and he chose to stand firm in spite of his circumstances. So I encourage you guys, we can stand firm in our faith and stand firm in our pursuit of God. But not only do we see them stand firm in main point one, their pursuit of God, but number two, they stand firm in their decision to trust God. They come to this critical point in Daniel's life and Daniel's story where they can decide either to trust God or to follow their own wisdom in these circumstances. There's no middle ground. They're going one way or another. You can't pick some of one and some of the other and kind of ride the fence, so to say. They had to make a decision. Are we going to trust God or are we not? Guys, I want to look at a couple of things here. Number one, I want you to see that God was at work. God's at work. In verse 9, it says, "Now God had brought Daniel into favor and tender love with the prince of the eunuchs." No doubt throughout this situation, Daniel's been here and maybe he's questioned, hey, is God really still here? Does God really still care for me? But yet we're given assurance here that, hey, God's still in this. God's still giving him favor. And guess what? God's purpose is greater than the problems that Daniel's facing. God has purpose, and we're going to see it unfold as we continue looking at this. It's so much greater. And guys, there's going to be times that you go through difficult times and times that I go through difficult times that maybe we ask those same questions. Does God really care for me? Would he let my loved one go through this if he really loved me? Or would this really be happening if God loved me and cared for me? And how is God in this situation? It just seems so hopeless. But yet, even as we're in that, we can trust that God is there. We may not always feel like God's there, but God's presence is not based on our feelings. God's given us a promise of his presence. Hebrews 13:5 promises us that God's never going to leave us. He's never going to forsake us. He will always be right here with us. And he's got a purpose that's greater than any problems that we're going to face in our lives. And here, how can we see that God's at work? We see that they make this deal, right? Daniel 1:10-14 here. And we're going to jump in at verse 11, actually. It says, "Then Daniel said to Melzar, whom the prince of the eunuchs had set over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Daniel says, 'Prove thy servants, I beseech thee, 10 days. Let them give us pulse to eat and water to drink. And let our countenances be looked upon before thee, and the countenance of the children that eat of the portion of the king's meat, as thou seest, deal with thy servants.' So he consented with them in this matter for 10 days. Guys, Daniel responds well to the authority in his life, but yet he responds to them in a submissive way, but while standing firm. He says, hey, let's try this. This is our convictions. This is our belief. Give us 10 days, and we believe that God's going to give us the same strength as we're eating pulse, which is essentially water and vegetables, as these men, they're eating the finest meats and the finest wine that the kingdom has to offer. He said, give us 10 days and let us prove it. And they agreed to it. His authorities over him say, hey, let's do it. But not only do you see that they tested, we see it successful. As we look at verse 15 and 16, it says, at the end of those 10 days, their countenance appeared fairer and fatter in flesh than all the children which should eat the portion of the king's meat. Thus, Melzar took away the portion of the meat and the wine that they should drink and gave them pulse. God honors them for this. God blesses them from a physical standpoint, that they're strong, they're healthy, and that they're able to serve, and they're in a healthier state than these other men who have been eating, again, the finest things that the kingdom had to offer. And then secondly here, we looked at how God was at work, but not only that, we see that God gifted them. Verse 17 gives us some pretty important information. It says, and for these 4 children, God gave them knowledge and skill in all learning and wisdom. And Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. It says, hey, God has given you these gifts, right? God's given these men these gifts of wisdom. He's given them the ability to understand and comprehend, and for Daniel to be able to interpret visions and dreams. And that's going to be key as we look through Daniel's life and how God uses him. But guys, let me challenge you with this today. God's given each one of you specific gifts. God's given me gifts. God's given every one of you gifts. Your gifts are going to be different from mine and each other's. My gift's not going to be the same maybe as any of yours. but yet God's given us each these unique abilities, these unique skill sets to be able to serve him more effectively in the way that he wants us to serve him. God had given Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego the skill set they needed to be able to serve him as he wanted them to in this foreign land of Babylon. And guys, as we look at that, there's going to be times where we wonder how we're supposed to handle these. How are we going to get through it? We have to trust that God's going to provide for us. He's going to give us the wisdom, the strength, the direction that we need to navigate these issues that we're going to face in life. And guys, just as we should all do, Daniel trusted God to work through him to accomplish his will. And each of our lives, God's going to be faithful to do this exact same thing. But lastly here, our last main point, we've looked at standing firm in our pursuit of God. We've looked at standing firm in our decision to trust God. And lastly, this evening, we're going to stand firm in our decision to serve God. Daniel 1, we're going to jump down to verse 18. It says, "Now at the end of the days that the king said that he should bring them in, that the prince of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar." Now, I don't know about you guys. Personally, I don't love exams. Here at college, we'll have midterms, and you guys even dealing with the same things in high school. I remember it well. Chemistry was my least favorite, but that's another subject for another day. We face these exams, and I don't know about you guys. It's not my favorite time of the year when it's exams, right? But yet, we see these men, they come forth in this exam. Their time is up, these 3 years are over, and they're brought before the king of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar. Now guys, Nebuchadnezzar is the most powerful man in the world. He is in charge of this empire that is dominating on the world stage. There's no one close to them at this point in time, technologically, militarily, just landmass in general. He is the top dog here. But yet they come before him, fully entrusting God, knowing that God's brought them this far, that God's going to bring them through this final exam. And we see letter A, they had success in their final exams. They were brought before King Nebuchadnezzar himself, and God had given them the abilities they needed. When God's working in us, and we obey the authority over us, we can see how God's purposes are greater than our problems. This purpose that God has for them is kind of coming to light at this point. They're seeing why God has put them here and put them in this position. But guys, we're going to look at that. Not only letter A, they had success in their final exams, but B, they were the valedictorians of their class. Guys, they didn't just barely get by or barely make it through. They were the absolute top of their class. Verse 19, it says, "And the king communed with them, and among them all was found none like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore stood they before the king. And in all matters of wisdom and understanding that the king inquired of them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and astrologers that are in all his realm." So guys, they're not just like marginally better. It's not like, the other people got a 3.5 GPA and they walk out with a 3.6. They're walking out of here 10 times better. They've got the 4.0. They've got all the tassels, all the acknowledgments. Guys, they have just done exceedingly abundantly above anything anybody else was able to do because of God's, because of God's presence in their life. Guys, and as we look at that, I want you to remember that God can bring us to this place where they're now standing before the king, the situation where just a few years before they're taken away, they're probably fearful of their own life. And now God's brought them into this place of some power and prestige, even being in the court of the king. This was no small deal. And God's purpose in this, again, it's being revealed as we've looked through and kind of seen it unfold in the story. And we're seeing it more and more so as we near the end of the chapter. But then letter C, they faithfully served the authorities that they were under. As you look at the book of Daniel, you discover that all 4 of these men faithfully served the authorities there in Babylon. Even though they weren't their kings by blood or by choice, they faithfully served the men that God had placed over them. I think it's especially something we see in the life of Daniel. It's pretty incredible. Daniel's a trusted advisor to King Nebuchadnezzar, but it goes past King Nebuchadnezzar. It's not just to King Nebuchadnezzar. He's also king to Belteshazzar, the next Babylonian king. After this, a whole nother empire has raised up and is able to overthrow the mighty Babylonian empire. And Daniel serves a king named Darius. This is the king that would be reigning at the time Daniel was thrown in the lion's den. And in verse 21, it says, "Daniel continued even unto the first year of King Cyrus." As we study through history, those 4 kings are in sequence to each other. And it's pretty incredible. You would think if you took over another nation, maybe the last person you would want advising you was the advisor to the previous king. But yet all 4 of these kings, God gave Daniel favor in their eyes, and they saw that God's presence was on him and the wisdom that Daniel had, and they recognized that. And they used him and allowed him to serve under these various kings. And it's super, super remarkable. Well, here we see again, and I know I've said it probably 10 times now, God's purpose was greater than Daniel's problems. This problem in his life has become something that God uses him to impact literally the world stage at the time. He has the ear of the most mighty men in the world. So guys, now you may be looking and saying, hey, well, why does this apply to me? So what, right? Well, let's answer the so what. Guys, Daniel was no older than really any of us. He was 15 to 20 years old, most people say, around this time that he was taken away. He was a young man. And we can look at that through the genealogies of the kings and kind of figure around that time frame. But guys, Daniel was a faithful servant from a young age. Daniel wasn't something that we're saying, well, one day I'll make that decision. One day I'll do that. No, it's a decision we have to make now. Otherwise, it'll be too late when this one day comes and we'll be swayed and not be able to make that decision. Their identity was rooted in their faith in God. And just like it was for them, our identity as Christians is rooted in our faith in Christ. It has to be part of who we are. Christianity isn't just something we do on Sundays and Wednesday nights. It's something that must be lived out in our lives every single day of every single week as we follow the Lord. They had no choice in the situation they were in. They had zero control over what happened in their life. But yet they trusted through each step of this that, hey, God's got a purpose. God's got a plan. I'll guarantee you there were times that they questioned it and wondered about it and were worried about it. But yet at the end of the day, they were able to trust that God's purpose overruled their problems. So guys, let me challenge you with a couple questions tonight. Think back on maybe a situation you faced recently, or maybe it's something you're facing right now. How are you responding to it? Are you responding to it by trusting in God, or are we maybe trying to manipulate or control a situation through our own wisdom? Do you see problems as opportunities for God to work in your life? Or do you simply look at it and say, man, that's terrible luck. Hopefully it'll go better next time. Guys, problems are just opportunities for God to show himself mighty in our lives. Do you allow your faithfulness to God to show? Or do you just wallow around in your own sadness and self-pity? It can be so easy to do for us. Say, oh, woe is me, and kind of have that mentality. But guys, God is faithful. There's no need to sit there and worry about ourselves, because we know that God's taking care of us in these times. My last question for you is, do you demonstrate that God's purposes are greater than your problems? Or do you let your problems cast a shadow on God's purpose? Which one is greater in your mind? Do you think God's purpose is greater? Or do you think your problems are greater? It's a weight that we all have to make that decision, but the choice is yours. You have to decide today, hey, do I trust God's purpose more than I worry about my problems? We have to choose to trust that. And let's take a moment and challenge you. Pray once we wrap up this lesson and give those decisions over to God. Give those hard times over to God and let him work and rule in your life. Thank you guys again for letting me join you guys tonight. I hope and pray that this was maybe a blessing in some way and encouraged you. And if there's ever anything I can do for you, feel free to reach out, holler at me. You can probably get me through Elijah. He's actually my suite mate, so I see him almost every day, and he's been a great friend to me, and I'm thankful for the opportunity to help him be able to serve and minister to you guys. But if there's ever anything I could do for you guys, please feel free to let me know. And I want you guys to know I'll be praying for you guys and for your church there in Lake Havasu City, and pray that God blesses you all this week, and just hope you have a great rest of your week.